Emerson, Lake and Palmer, sometimes known as ELP to their friends, were a progressive rock supergroup with Keith Emerson, who'd come from a band called The Nice, Greg Lake, who'd come from a band called King Crimson, that some people have heard of, and Carl Palmer, who'd come from The Crazy World of Arthur Brown and Atomic Rooster. They were effectively active for the 1970s, with several reincarnations and reimaginings since then. So Palmer played drums, Lake played bass and guitars, and Emerson played keyboards, mostly a Hammond organ, but synths and all sorts of keyboards he could get his hands on. This effectively means that for a lot of their music, there were a trio of bass, drums, and organ, with Greg Lake also singing at times. So their most recognisable sound is organ-led complexity. They have been known to use guitars at various points, but they're definitely got a keyboard focus. They were also particularly influenced by classical music, and applying classical styles to much of their music and adapting classical classics, so things written by classical composers, into a kind of mixture between classical and rock. As with many progressive rock bands, what they did had a tendency towards being complex and very musically accomplished. Possibly more than any other band, they came under attack in the late 70s for being pompous and pretentious. And often they do feel like they were a vehicle, particularly for Keith Emerson to show off. I think Keith Emerson's fingers must have had some kind of speed up, power up to them, because he was an absolutely incredible keyboard player from quite a young age.
Hi, my name's Dan, and this is a review of Brain Salad Surgery by Emerson, Lake and Palmer, which was released in 1973 and was their fourth studio album. Now, I'm fairly familiar with this album. I've had a copy for a while. I, reviewed it before, so this is not my first rodeo at reviewing. Been doing these video reviews for just over 3 years now. Before that, I had a blog that I had for a couple of years where I was reviewing stuff from a different list. And before that, I did some reviews on Facebook, which was kind of my first real outing into reviews. And I created a list of the greatest prog rock albums of all time and reviewed my way through it. Done by amalgamating from a couple of lists that I'd found. And of course, this came up as I did that. So, but that wasn't my first time listening to it, because I listened to it first a few years before that. Bizarrely, I can remember that I first listened to it whilst I was playing World of Warcraft, because it's an album that still invokes images from the game in my mind. As I listen to the music, I still see flashes of it. I get that with other places as well, particularly. So there was a period in time when I used to have a Walkman and I used to listen to music as I walked around. And there are certain albums that just remind me very strongly of specific places. Um, it's a little bit surprising in some ways to me that I hadn't had a copy of it before that, though. So it is an LP that I'd seen many times in shops in my late teens and my 20s, and I never bought a copy. It was one of those maybe someday albums that I kind of kept kind of pushing down the list. I think possibly because I didn't have a lot of money at that time, and I was often just looking for something that I thought would be good, but was actually relatively cheap. Secondhand copies of this were never that particularly cheap. So I'm going to describe this as progressive rock. I don't think anybody would argue with that. It's a curious album in some ways because it's quite disparate. It's quite a lot of different things going on here. And in this case, I think that makes it quite a rich album. There's a lot to get into. So actually, I'm going to do something that I don't usually do on these album reviews, which is I'm going to talk about all the different tracks on here. This is fairly easy because there aren't that many of them. So it's not going to take too long. Now, I'm going to start with Carnival 9, which is a 30-minute multi-part fantasy epic about a futuristic carnival show. It's got long instrumental passages and it's got lots of different musical parts to it. It's so long that it actually spanned more than one half of the LP, and it had to start on the first half and then was continued on the second half. Some later reissues managed to kind of splice that together, so it was in the three parts it was originally meant to be. So there's that. That's my favourite track on the album. There's Jerusalem, which is an adaptation of a hymn, which is in some ways unusual for ELP because, well, certainly a lot of the lyrics were written by Greg Lake, and he was at times fairly anti-Christian. But ELP do like their classical music, so they've taken this and done an adaptation. Another one that is classical adaptation is Toccata, which is an adaptation of Ginestera's first piano concerto, fourth movement. I looked that up. So this guy usually didn't give permission for people to do adaptations of his work, but ELP went to see him in person to persuade him, and they played him the tape that they'd made, and he loved it. He said it was diabolical, which they initially thought that he meant that he hated it, but no, he meant it in a good way. He meant it sounded like it was to do with the devil and stuff. What else we got? Still, You Turn Me On is a kind of ballady thing. And I just want to check the name of that because I've got that as, Still You Turn Me On. I don't know why I put the word leaves in front of that, so sorry about that. Kind of a soft ballady song, yes. Probably the most unusual here is Benny the Bouncer, which is a kind of a music hall bawdy pub song sung in a growly way. And the two songs there, Still You Turn Me On, and Benny the Bouncer, do feel a bit out of place on the album, but they do balance the album out somewhat. So I guess that's a good thing. And it does follow also a sort of British prog tradition that was started by bands in the 60s like Procol Harum, who tended to do something more kind of music hall-y or comic-y or something like that. Just throw one in there. And actually, you'll see this in quite a few of the early 70s prog rock and late 60s pre-prog stuff. They had a tendency to do this. It's a style of thing that actually the Beatles as well engaged, did the occasional song that was like that. Rest of it, though, lots of complex and proggy musical stuff. Huge emphasis on the keyboards. We've got organs, pianos, and the world's first polyphonic synth, which was a precursor to a production version, which was the Moog or Moog Apollo. Right, I've just got to put a pin in there. Last time I talked about a synthesizer and used the name Moog, I was pulled up for it. Some people like it to be pronounced Moog. Bob Moog himself was asked about this, and he said that he tends to use Moog, but he didn't seem particularly mind between them. Seemed to. I grew up calling them Moog, and everybody about me called them Moog. I'm trying to transition to Moog because there are peasants who really enjoy them. Back to the album. Greg Lake, his singing is good. It is always good, I have to say. I do like his singing. I don't always like his words, but he's got some great delivery in the singing. So I do find this album quite enjoyable, especially Carnival 9, which is my fave. But it does suffer from one of the things that I will complain about with ELP, which is that I've been picking this apart a little bit more because I've been listening to it again. I think it's a little bit too aggressive in how much it shows off. Now, prog is almost always quite show-offy, but some of it, it's a lot of it doesn't seem to kind of ram it down your throat quite as strong as this. It feels like they're trying to batter you down with it, and that you've got to admit that we are so good at playing instruments. Mostly, I'm afraid this comes down to Keith Emerson, who is impossibly talented with his fingers. He must have about 15 fingers on each hand, and he seems to have been this good from quite a young age as well. So I don't know how on earth he managed that. Some people really love ELP. Some people really hate ELP. I'm kind of feel like I mostly like ELP. They're not my favorite prog band, and I have this little kind of niggle with them about how show-offy it is. There we go. That's what I think of this album. As always, I'd love to know what you think, though. So please, will you tell me by leaving me a comment? And that's it from me for now.
Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. We're so glad you could attend. Come inside, come inside. There behind the glass stands a real blade of grass. Be careful as you pass. Move along